Our next speaker, Dennis Frye, will discuss the facts and fiction surrounding the legacy of George McClellan's tactical decisions during the Maryland Campaign of 1862. Dennis is chief historian at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. He is a prominent Civil War historian with numerous appearances on PBS, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, C-SPAN, and A&E. He helped produce the Emmy Award-winning television series and features on the Battle of Antietam, abolitionist John Brown, and the state of Maryland during the Civil War. Dennis is the co-founder and first president of the Save Historic Antietam Foundation, which does tremendous work, and he's the co-founder and former president of today's Civil War Trust, as well as receiving the Trust's Shelby Foote Award. Dennis also earned the prestigious Nevins Freeman Award for lifetime achievements in the Civil War community. He is a well-known author, and his book, Harpers Ferry Under Fire, received the National Book of the Year Award from the Association of Partners for Public Lands. Please join me in welcoming Dennis Frye.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Chris. It's a great pleasure. That sounds good. Yeah, for those of you that know me, I don't like microphones. For those of you that know me, I don't like podiums. For those of you that know me, I don't use any notes when I speak. And for those of you that know me, I move a lot. So I'll be around. I won't be a pendulum. I won't be Ed Bars back and forth and back and forth. But Ed taught me a lot about how to be a good public speaker. And we were joking a little earlier about where's my PowerPoint. They were scurrying around looking for a PowerPoint. I tell you what will make a successful career. I have worked for the National Park Service for almost 40 years, and never once have I done a PowerPoint. And so if I can escape to retirement without doing a PowerPoint, I will be absolutely thrilled that my career has been successful. This is a great, Chris, thanks so much for inviting me and having me here for Sacred Trust. This is such a great experience. To be here on the battlefield on July the 3rd, I just took the walk from the Visitor Center to Cemetery Ridge and just stood there in awe and amazement, knowing what was happening there 153 years ago. And what struck me most, I think, is how quiet it is. Yeah, I was surrounded by motorcycles, and I don't know how many dozens and dozens of cars that went around me, and there are hundreds and hundreds of people that are out there on the field. But for me, I was caught in that moment, knowing that all the noise that we have surround us today on the field is not comparable to what was happening today on these grounds 153 years ago. I will say one thing that's almost comparable. Last night, for those of you, again, that know me, I live about, my wife and I, Sylvia and I, live about 1 mile south of Burnside Bridge, just off the Antietam battlefield. And the home that we own was actually General Burnside's headquarters right after the battle. And we've restored that and lived there for a long time. In fact, I was very privileged to discover years ago that we had a famous visitor come to that home to conference with General Burnside on October the 2nd, 1862. His name was Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln actually came into my home on October the 2nd when he came to visit the Army of the Potomac, to congratulate the Army, to congratulate McClellan for ending the first invasion of the North. And every morning when I get up and walk on the floorboards of the first floor in the hallway, I know the President of the United States, the President of the United States, the greatest president in American history that universally is agreed by American historians, was in my home conferencing with Burnside. I'm such a great admirer of President Lincoln that I even have my dog named Mr. Lincoln. And so when you come into the home there, and last night an event occurred not too far from my home. And that event was at the battlefield. They had a fireworks display that went on for about 25 minutes. Well, there's a mountain less than 300 feet from where our house is, very high. And all of those fireworks reverberating, pounding, blasting off of that mountain last night for just 25 minutes. I knew at least what it sounded like on September the 17th, 1862, what it sounded like. And I actually was again lost and frozen for a moment in time with the owners of that property, the Showman family, who had to be terrified, petrified at what they were hearing. Even though they couldn't see the battle, they could certainly hear it roaring and pounding off of that mountain. Like every moment the earth was quaking and moving under their home. Pretty frightening. I didn't watch that fireworks display last night to enjoy fireworks, but instead to actually feel some terror, as all the people here did that were hosting the battle on July the 3rd and having their homes and their lives and their farms wrecked, some of them forever. I want to get right to this. This talk I've never done before. Very exciting. I've been speaking publicly for 45 years. This is the first time this program has been given. And it really was inspired by this book right here, September Suspense, Lincoln's Union in Peril. The premise of this program is that indeed, in September of 1862, none of us knew, and none of them knew, if the United States was going to survive for another month. Oh, incidentally, pardon my wound here. This happened yesterday when I was attacked by a rose bush, so please, I apologize for this. No one knew if the United States was going to continue to exist. Now, that's just an outrageous statement. Of course we're going to exist. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in September of 1862, no one can predict what's going to happen the next day. In fact, when I wrote September Suspense, I actually had a photograph beside me to remind me as a historian that the people that are living at the moment, experiencing the moment, going through the trial, tribulation of the moment, don't know what the outcome will be. Historians, we've got a great advantage. We know what happened. We already know the story. How boring is that when you already know the story? No wonder kids don't like history. You start with the end of the story first. It's like watching a football game that you missed, that you taped, and then you hear the score on the radio before you get to watch it. Yeah. And so, they don't know what's going to happen in September of 1862. They have no idea. That photograph that I kept beside me while I was writing this book, reminding me every day they didn't know what was about to occur, was a photograph taken on September the 11th of the Twin Towers collapsing. None of us knew that was coming. But it transformed who we are. It changed us. I love the title of this symposium. The Civil War changes who we are. It made everything different. And what I'm going to talk about for just the next few moments are four things, only four things that happened in September of 1862 that completely changed who we are, made us different, and I will submit to you, saved the United States. And I will also suggest that the person responsible for saving the United States in September of 1862 was a man who I actually don't like at all. I can't stand him. It's hard for me to utter his name. He is arrogant, insubordinate, insensitive, about everything you could think of that is a dislike for a human being. I could tag this man with those titles. I'm going to have to say it. George B. McClellan absolutely did, in September of 1862, save the United States. He himself said he saved the United States. Which, of course, is the problem, because his ego always went before his mouth. And his ego is front and forward all the time, every moment. When you study McClellan, you are studying ego, bombast, arrogance, on and on. All of you know people like that. All of you may have worked with someone like that. And I pity any of you who've worked for somebody like that. They are typically not people we like. However, when I was writing this book, tried to remove myself from my personal prejudice against McClellan. Extremely difficult to do, because I've spent 40 plus years bashing George McClellan. It's been great entertainment for me, and any of you who've heard me do it over the years. And I'm not the only one who's done this, of course. There are other scholars and authors, in fact, almost all scholars and authors, who have spent much of their career studying the Antietam campaign and bashing McClellan. But I had to reverse myself. I had to look at myself honestly and say, wait a minute. Did McClellan do some things that really did change the course of the campaign? Does he deserve credit that he gave himself and everyone has dismissed because he patted himself on the back. Perhaps McClellan did do some things. 4 things specifically. Not a single one of them occurred on September the 17th. So when Chris said this was going to be tactical, it's exactly the opposite. Sorry, I gave you the wrong information. This is strategic. This is big picture. This is grand strategy that we're talking about. When you look at McClellan, you think of the Antietam campaign, the Maryland campaign, typically you think about the tactics of the campaign, and especially that big question, why didn't he finish Lee off? Why didn't he destroy him on September the 17th? Why wasn't the Army in Northern Virginia completely crushed? Why didn't the war end on September the 17th, 1862? How many times have we asked ourselves that question? How many times have I, as a historian, been asked that question? And it all goes to McClellan and McClellan's lack of performance. But let me talk about 4 things he did that changed the alignment of American history. And these are substantial. And I could tell you something else. I went through the books in the bookstore on Antietam. None of those books look at it this way. This doesn't make me special. It doesn't make me unique. It's just that I've been studying this campaign for over half a century because I had the great privilege of growing up only a few miles from the Antietam battlefield in Harpers Ferry. So what I'm talking to you about is my home, my backyard. My personal experience of living there and constantly thinking, studying, analyzing what happened in that 2 weeks of September of 1862, literally in my backyard. So I have evolved, and all good historians should evolve. Shame on the historian who writes a book and never changes position. Because if they continue to do research, they're going to make new discoveries. And when they make new discoveries, it gives you new interpretations. And when it gives you new interpretations, it gives you new opportunities for a program like this. So here we go. None of these happened on the battlefield, but they all changed who we are as a country. First, I'm going to have to use my hands here for a moment as geography. This is why I don't need PowerPoint. I'll use my hands. I'm going to show you a map. All right, Pennsylvania. There's the Mason-Dixon line right there. Potomac River flowing right here like this. The distance between the Mason-Dixon line and the Potomac River at Harpers Ferry, 37 miles, pretty close. As you know, at one point you get out towards Clear Spring, Maryland, a little bit to the west. Maryland's only 1.5 miles wide. So you can go from the Confederacy into Maryland and into the United States in at most 2 days. At most 2 days. Lincoln's Union truly is in peril right now. Lee knows that. That's the reason Lee strategically takes this moment to advance. No matter that his army's in poor shape, no matter that nearly 50% of his men don't have shoes, no matter that he's got very little food with him, no matter that most of his men are almost naked, wearing rags, doesn't make any difference. We're the Confederate Army. We are victorious. The Army in Northern Virginia has not been defeated. We have rescued Richmond, and let's move, and let's end this thing, and now is the moment to do it. Lee knows that politically we're only a few weeks from the elections of 1862, November 62, congressional elections. Lee knows that the Democrats, if they take command of the House, could end the war. Literally, if you know the Constitution, appropriations come out of the Constitution. We can end the war if the Democrats come back in command. And Lee knows that there's going to be implementation of a draft for the first time in the United States, which the people of the United States object to. They don't like the idea of forced service. All these things, in not even to mention the pressure and the force and the drive and the momentum for emancipation, all of these things are out there. And Lee knows it. He knows the Republicans' hold in the Congress is tenuous. He knows this is the first national referendum on the Republican Party as the national party in command. So if Lee can get into Pennsylvania, launch invasion into Yankee country, somewhere in Adams County, Franklin County, head towards Carlisle, head towards York, head towards the Susquehanna River, anything. Every day he spends in Pennsylvania in the Quaker state are votes against Republicans and votes against the Lincoln administration and votes against Lincoln's continuation of the war. Lee knows that. So here they come into Maryland. They come to Frederick. Back to my map. Frederick, right here. Washington, right there. South and east. North is this way, incidentally. So between Frederick and Washington, 40 miles. That is a 2-day march for the Army of Northern Virginia to move to Washington. The Yankees don't know what Lee's plans are. They don't know what his intentions are. They don't know where he's going. They have no idea. We know because it already happened, but they don't. Remember September the 11th. You don't know what the morrow will bring. But McClellan, George McClellan, made a bold move that changed the course of the invasion. Remember, Frederick here, Washington there. The assumption would be that Lee would move against Washington. Why? That's a safe assumption. We spent 18 months with Union armies moving against Richmond, seize the other enemy's capital. But the real vulnerable point was not Washington, ladies and gentlemen. Watch this. Remember Richmond? I'm going to move into the southern capital, Richmond, and you go south of Richmond, and 30 miles south of Richmond is a very significant railroad town called Petersburg. And what was U.S. Grant's strategy in 1864? Don't strike Richmond, go to the underbelly, go to Petersburg. And by doing that, you cut off effectively the Confederate capital and its resources. George McClellan saw the same opportunity available for Robert E. Lee in September of 1862, and the target wasn't Washington, but Baltimore. Baltimore was the Petersburg, exactly the same as Petersburg for the United States capital. There was one railroad in and out of Washington from the north, and that came right through Baltimore. Baltimore, unlike Washington, which was the most heavily defended city in the world in September 1862, more fortifications, more cannon, anywhere place on the planet, Lee wasn't going there, but Baltimore had no forts other than Fort McHenry and a few earthworks up on Federal Hill. That was it. There were no troops. It was totally vulnerable. With Lee with an army of nearly 50,000 men moved towards Baltimore, Washington is completely isolated with no way to get supports, no way to get the reserves, and completely cut off. What a better way for Robert E. Lee to end the war than to isolate Washington, D.C. Now, you know that didn't happen. This isn't what-if history. For George McClellan, that was when will it happen? At the moment history. McClellan knew, looking at the map, that Baltimore was the most vulnerable city in the United States the first week of September and the second week of 1862. He knew it. Just with that simple explanation I gave you, you cannot lose Baltimore. Baltimore is undefended. So the first decision McClellan made was to send the bulk of the Army of the Potomac not to General Lee at Frederick, but to Baltimore, towards Baltimore. Brilliant by Little Mac. Brilliant. He automatically protects Washington just by sending Burnside's 1st and 9th Corps, that wing of the Army, toward Baltimore. Move number 1. I'll bet you never read about it. It is absolutely imperative to the United States' success. Move number 2. The date is September the 11th, 1862. Does anybody know where Robert E. Lee is on September the 11th, 1862? Now you ponder that for a moment. Now you probably know where a whole lot of other people are on that day, but where's Lee? Once again, understated, undervalued, not discussed. Robert E. Lee on September the 11th, 1862, here's my map again, Frederick, Hagerstown, Harpers Ferry. Lee has moved from Frederick north and west to Hagerstown. And Lee on September the 11th has pitched camp 4 miles from the Mason-Dixon line. 4 miles. That's where the Army of Northern Virginia is going, ladies and gentlemen, Franklin County. Now there's a little diversion under the way on September the 11th because 2 out of every 3 Confederates is moving to Harpers Ferry. And for those of you that are interested in that, this book talks a lot about that. And incidentally, if you want this book, you better get it here because there's only one other place that's sold in the country, and that's at Harpers Ferry. This book was published by the nonprofit organization that supports the National Park at Harpers Ferry. They sell it exclusively at Harpers Ferry. So today it's off-site. If you'd like this, this will tell you about what's happening at Harpers Ferry.
Where
Harpers Ferry under fire. And so, Lee has one eye on Jackson at Harpers Ferry with 2/3 of the Confederate Army. I'm not going to go into that fight down there. And the other eye on Pennsylvania. Nobody's watching McClellan. Well, you might remember on September the 11th, that is a few days before McClellan has even discovered Special Orders 191. But in the meantime, Lee's getting nervous because McClellan is moving west towards South Mountain, even before the discovery of Lee's orders that split up his army. Those movements by themselves are giving some nerve to General Lee, making him worry a bit. He didn't expect this. Now look at this. Here's Lee with 1/3 of the army at Hagerstown. Here's Jackson with 2/3 of the army at Harpers Ferry. And here comes McClellan from the east to the west, going right towards the middle of the two. Right towards the middle of the two, with the only thing blocking them, South Mountain. Jackson gets delayed. Jackson is late. Harpers Ferry doesn't surrender, doesn't capitulate, doesn't fall. Now Lee gets very nervous because all of a sudden on September the 14th, like a rattlesnake that just came out of its den looking for prey, McClellan strikes and moves towards South Mountain while Lee and Jackson are still separated by almost 30 miles. Now, you all think about Special Orders 191 and the fact that it gets lost, and all authors will argue that the only reason McClellan moves is because he has those orders. Not true. He was moving before he got the orders. He was moving towards Lee, right to Lee's gut, right to his belly, before he even got 191. 191 just confirmed the separation of the Confederate Army. It accelerated McClellan's move, and you know what happened as a result of McClellan moving against Lee? Lee had to withdraw from the Mason-Dixon line, bring 1/3 of his army from where it was poised to go into Franklin County, and brings it back towards Harpers Ferry to try to rescue Jackson. It completely altered the campaign. Everybody gives credit for the fact that Lost Orders 191 was lost. That's true. But McClellan doesn't get any credit for actually moving against the Confederates while Lee was in such a vulnerable position. That is significant. It completely changes alters his plan going north to all of a sudden looking to his rear and his belly, which would become vulnerable. Number 3, Battle of South Mountains occurred. Lee withdraws to Sharpsburg. Lee's along the Antietam Creek. Harpers Ferry has surrendered. Lee is waiting along the Antietam Creek to concentrate his army at Sharpsburg. There is a road there at Sharpsburg, a road. This is the most significant decision that will be made by George McClellan, perhaps in the whole campaign. On September the 16th, the day before the battle, when historians will tell you that George McClellan was twiddling his fingers doing nothing, and that he should have attacked the enemy while the enemy had not yet consolidated, and while McClellan is being condemned for not striking with an army that was multi-times bigger than Lee, while Lee's was separated into components, all those criticisms that are hurled at McClellan. Yet, what did McClellan do on September the 16th that completely changed Robert E. Lee's program? Completely altered the invasion and forced Lee into a box where Lee was trapped. Yeah, McClellan did this, trapped Lee. What he did was, again using my hands here, here's Sharpsburg right here, Sharpsburg. There's the Mason-Dixon line. Hagerstown's right here. Due north, 10 miles, Sharpsburg to Hagerstown. 5 more miles north is the Mason-Dixon line. So what I'm suggesting to you is, in that very narrow part of Maryland, from Sharpsburg to the Mason-Dixon line is only 15 miles. 15 miles. That is an easy one-day march for the Army of Northern Virginia. And so there's all this talk that after the Battle of South Mountain that Lee had canceled the invasion, that the invasion's over. We're going back home to Virginia. McClellan came out of nowhere and has forced us back across the Potomac River. No! On September the 16th, the day after Harpers Ferry has capitulated, Lee has completely altered his frame of mind. He was going back home, but Harpers Ferry surrenders. He now is at Antietam, at Sharpsburg, not to fight the enemy. Let me repeat that. not to fight the enemy. Robert E. Lee has no intention of fighting a battle at Sharpsburg. None. Prove to me where you can find Robert E. Lee says, I'm going to stand here and fight. Doesn't exist. Now, Douglas Southall Freeman will tell you it exists, and I'm a great admirer of Freeman. But what he quotes was written 35 years after the Civil War. We shall make our stand on these hills. 35 years later. Plenty of time to think about it. No, it wasn't in Lee's interest to stand at Sharpsburg and fight. The enemy territory is only 15 miles away, 1 day's march. We're back on again. Invasion is a go, green light. So all he's doing at Sharpsburg is waiting for Jackson to come and consolidate, bring the army back together again, and we're off. And he knows McClellan will follow him north. That's okay. Lee wants a fight in the north, not at Sharpsburg. Why didn't they get to Pennsylvania? The answer is summarized in 2 words: George McClellan. That's very painful. George McClellan. Because on September the 16th, what McClellan does, and it's extraordinary, and historians just don't pay any attention to it. I didn't pay attention to it for 40 years. What McClellan does is he does a flanking maneuver around Lee's left, and when he does that, McClellan, the most important thing McClellan did on the 16th, he seized the road to Hagerstown. He blocks it. Lee can't use that route to go north. McClellan does that without firing a shot. That is incredible. The invasion has just been crushed because he doesn't have a road, a path to go there. George McClellan did that. That's number 3. All right, finally, battle occurs on the 17th. Bloody day. 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. Antietam tactically is always referred to as a standoff. Nobody wins. Let's go to September 19th and September the 20th. Lee has withdrawn. Now, it's not right to say that Lee retreats. Too many of us, including me for a long time, the Maryland campaign ends with the Battle of Antietam on September the 18th and Lee retreating. That's wrong. That didn't happen. Lee leaves the battlefield. He withdraws. It's a strategic withdrawal to Virginia. And if you read Lee's words on September the 21st and September the 22nd that he sends to his president, Jefferson Davis, the plan was to continue the invasion by moving the army back across the Potomac into Virginia near Shepherdstown. Then, watch my hands again, Shepherdstown's here, Williamsport's here, Williamsport on the Potomac River. Move the army up along the Potomac River, north and west to Williamsport, and then cross the Potomac again at Williamsport, rush to Hagerstown, and keep the invasion alive. That's what Lee's plan is after September the 17th and 18th. It's not over. It's not over. In fact, how do we know it's not over? He actually sends Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry to Williamsport to seize Williamsport on the Maryland side of the river after Antietam for a bridgehead, for a Confederate bridgehead. This is still going on. It's alive. September 17th is not the end. My final George McClellan point. McClellan anticipated Lee doing this. McClellan figured it out. And as Lee was sending Stuart towards Williamsport, George McClellan was sending his cavalry. You read about the Maryland campaign, nobody mentions the cavalry. McClellan sends his cavalry to Williamsport. And just to back it up, he sends the entire Union 6th Corps, nearly 11,000 infantrymen, to Williamsport to ensure the Confederates can't recross the river. So sure enough, Jeb Stuart shows up at Williamsport and he says, uh-oh, look what McClellan has done. And only then did Lee cancel the invasion. Only at that point, when Lee knew he could not get across the river and continue north, did Lee end it. So, in sum, 4 very decisive moments during 2 weeks in September 1862 that you probably never thought about, that completely changed the nature of the invasion. 1, salvation of Baltimore by McClellan. Big deal. 2, Lee left the Mason-Dixon line not because of the loss of Special Orders 191, but because of George McClellan's aggressive moves towards South Mountain and towards the vulnerable belly of Lee's divided army. 3, September the 16th, seizing the Sharpsburg-Hagerstown Turnpike. No way could Lee go north that route. And finally, George McClellan blocks Lee one more time at Williamsport on September 19th, September 20th, ensuring the invasion was over. So, ladies and gentlemen, yes, George McClellan, as he himself said, saved the Union. He did it. He did it. What's interesting is it took me 4 decades to believe him. And I hope I've made a believer out of you. Thank you all very much. Got time for questions? All right. Am I still on, Warren? Am I still on? Okay. For any of you that know me well, I love to provoke people. I don't like to just recite chapter and verse what we've all recited for years. So I hope I have provoked some of you. I hope I've made some of you downright angry. I hope that some of you are looking at me saying, I can't believe he just stood up there for 30 minutes and talked about George McClellan and how good he is. I mean, how absurd is that? And so this is an opportunity for some questions back and forth. Warren's got the mic so everybody can hear you. So don't be bashful. Take me on. Come on, take me on.
What about McClellan as a presidential candidate?
That necessitates a drink. What about George McClellan as a presidential candidate? I think that's actually a very, very relevant, pertinent question. Politics, politics, politics. Here we are in a political season. It's an election year. Politics are on our mind. We have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, just like we have in 1862 and 1864. Great question, thank you. Yeah, and the more I've studied this, the more I'm convinced the Republicans could not let George McClellan be a victor. Politically, they couldn't allow that to happen. Couldn't happen. They needed to do everything they could to smear George McClellan, because they all knew McClellan was the most popular Democrat in the country. They all knew McClellan would probably be the nominee in 1864. They all knew that's who they were going to. They were looking into the future, trying to predict who their opposite candidate would be, their opposition in 1864. They all focused on McClellan. McClellan himself didn't do anything to tamper down the Democrats' interest in elevating him to presidential status. So here we have George McClellan winning. Not only did he win, he saved the Union. He stopped an invasion. He protected Pennsylvania. He protected Baltimore and Washington. This man was successful. You would never know it because of the way the Republicans attacked George McClellan in the aftermath of Antietam. Where did these myths come from that the Army in Northern Virginia should have been destroyed right there and then on September the 17th? That was created by politics. And so McClellan had a lot of faults. But what the Republicans very brilliantly did was take these faults and publicize them and magnify them to the point where it tarnished his reputation dramatically. McClellan still today, 154 years after the Battle of Antietam, is still considered a failure. That's how successful the tarnishment was. So yeah, absolutely. It happened right away. It was quick. There was the the congressional investigation, the committee, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. They just tar and feathered McClellan. You moved too slow. You had your chances. You got the enemy's orders. You didn't destroy them on September the 17th when you should have. The war should be over, and we're still fighting because of you, you idiot. And so it was very successful. It was a very, very good way to try to harm and ruin the reputation of McClellan for political purpose. And like I said, 154 years later, still successful.
Over here, Dennis.
Was McClellan's having the slows, as Lincoln would put it, really a reflection of his political point of view, which was, I want to get the South to come back to us by a soft war instead of a very hard war?
Well, there's no question. There is no question that Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan had two different visions for the future of the United States. Now, they had a unified vision in this regard. They wanted the United States unified. They wanted one nation. Lincoln and McClellan were eye to eye on that. After that, about everything else they disagreed with. And so, for example, Lincoln and the Republicans seeking emancipation, freedom. McClellan wanted to have nothing to do with that. The Union as it was, the Constitution as it is. And so, big difference. Another example would be what you just mentioned about trying to softly bring the South back. They're our brothers and our sisters. Well, McClellan felt the same way. McClellan felt the South was, Lincoln felt the South was basically prodigal sons and daughters. And Lincoln did his best to try not to harm them permanently. That all would change by 1864. George McClellan would have had nothing to do with the idea of total war that we had in 1864 and 1865. That was anathema to him. And so, yeah, there's big differences between the way they approach things. But let me tell you about George McClellan's greatest moment. Greatest moment. It didn't even happen what I described to you. It happened after the Confederates had already gone home. It happened when President Lincoln visited McClellan the first week of October, 1862, congratulate him in the Army. And then the president leaves. I have a new book that will be coming out hopefully next year, which is called Antietam's Strange Story. Myth, it gets better. Myth, mystery, and machination. Like that alliteration. Myth, mystery, machination. And I have a chapter in there, and each one, incidentally, each of these chapters is only about 1,000 words long. You read this really fast. It's got over 60 chapters, but each one of those chapters is snap your finger and you're done, snap your finger and you're done. I make the point and move on. Get to it. And so I have a chapter in there which I have tentatively called McClellan's Greatest Moment, and it deals with a decision that McClellan made. Who was the most powerful man in the United States of America the first week of October 1862? It was not the President of the United States. It was George Brenton McClellan. And he had 130,000 eager recruits that would go anywhere he wanted them to and do anything he wanted them to do. And so when Abraham Lincoln, on September the 22nd, issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was anathema to everything that George McClellan represented, if we were ever going to have an opportunity for an overthrow of an elected democratic government by the United States military, that was the moment. And George McClellan had that moment in his hands. And he would have succeeded. He could have said, Mr. President, you have completely usurped all of your authority, and we're not going to put up with that, and I'm taking over. And he would have the army to back him. McClellan, instead of accepting that temptation, and there were members, strong members of the Democratic Party, who were encouraging him literally to do that, to become a dictator, at least temporarily. McClellan resisted that temptation, and this was his greatest moment. He issued an order to the Army stating, we will adhere to the policy of the elected President of the United States. Talk about a moment that could have changed all of us forever. George McClellan gets no credit for that. Yes, sir. Question.
Between George McClellan and Grant,
polar opposites. Grant is very aggressive. McClellan is hesitant a little bit. The one question I have is, using McClellan's tactics, do you think he could ever win the war the way Grant did, or win the war at all?
So would McClellan win the war? Well, it depends on what the definition of win the war is. The Republicans have a certain definition of winning the war. The Democrats have another definition of winning the war. And so you need to remember that most Southern politicians were Democrats prior to the secession of the South. And so it was in the interest of the Northern Democratic Party to bring their brothers and sisters from the South back into the Democratic Party and to reestablish the Democratic majority in the Congress and to ensure maintenance of the Supreme Court in the hands of the Democrats. And so two very different outcomes. And they fought the war very differently. I mean, Grant followed the instruction of the Republican president and helped bring total war in 64 and 65 because the Confederates were not going to collapse. The Confederates knew that the only way they could ever possibly succeed with secession was through politics, not military. And so McClellan, if elected in 64, perhaps would have had a negotiated peace of some sort. What it would have been is impossible to determine. But McClellan's plan never would have been the Lincoln plan. Incidentally, before we get this question, one more little thing here that we have Antietam revealed. This covers the entire campaign, but if you want to read something quickly, this was written in bullet points. For example, the first sentence in this book is literally a bullet point. There are 1,865 bullet points in this book. It's one of those great books you can take to the John with you, put it aside, and then come back and start reading again, and you haven't lost anything, at least not in the book. And so the very first thing in the book is, number one, Antietam is a Native American word that translates as, quote, swift current. That's it. Then you go to number two. So if any ever interested, Antietam Revealed takes a look at the whole campaign through very quick bullets. That is the way most of us read things today. Yes, sir, question.
Nice marketing.
Virginia Tech you got there. Yes, sir. Hokie. There's another Hokie right over here.
One of McClellan's key aides, Colonel Thomas Key, was quoted as saying that the name of the game was to not win, but to exhaust both sides so that they would come to the table and negotiate and have peace
Yes.
without much destruction.
Right. You know what happened to him, don't you?
Yeah. And any truth to
If
that?
you don't know what happened to Colonel Key, that word got out, and it got out in the newspapers. Mm-hmm. When I wrote September Suspense, I spent 2 years every morning reading 1862 newspapers because I wanted to find out what was going on in 1862, not 2012. And so I didn't stop at Antietam. I kept on going all the way through the election of 1862. And Colonel Key, who basically said, we don't care what the administration thinks. We don't care what the Republicans want. We don't care what Mr. Lincoln desires. That doesn't make any difference. This is what George McClellan wants, and we're going to back him up. That got out. That got leaked. That's not good. And Key was thrown under the bus for it. He was cashiered from the Army. Could have been tried for treason. Wasn't, but could have been. And so it was out there. It was known by millions of Americans that there were two plans for the future of the country. The Lincoln plan and the McClellan plan.
Was that really McClellan's plan?
Probably. Yes. It would be consistent. Yes. Yeah, what Key said would have been consistent. Do we have time for one more, Warren? Yes, sir. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Curious about your theory on the committee.
Theory? You're saying what I'm saying is theory?
How the committee on the conduct of the war, the Republicans on it, smeared McClellan, but the 1864 presidential vote, the Army vote went heavily for Lincoln. And how does that, the soldiers who would have known him best, would have known McClellan best, voted against him? How does that fit in with your theory?
Well, first of all, probably 200,000 men that would have voted for George McClellan in 1862 are dead in 1864. Think about that. They're dead. Secondly, for the first time in American history, you didn't have to go home to cast your vote. The Republicans figured out a way, this is smart politics, that you could stay in the Army, stay in the ranks, and cast your vote like an absentee ballot. That had never been done before. Soldiers like that. And thirdly, you can't compare 1862 and 1864. You really can't. In 1862, the war could have ended in 1862. Either side could have won in 1862, could have ended it. By 1864, the only thing that's going to end this war is total war. And the North knows that. And any soldier that has lost a brother, has lost a father, any soldier whose father has lost a son, your cousin's been killed, your uncle's been killed, your neighbor, your neighbors, your whole block has been killed. By 1864, the investment in this war by veteran soldiers, George McClellan's not going to get that vote. These soldiers are going to finish it. There's been too much blood, too much loss. It's personal by 1864. You got to remember in 1862, hundreds of thousands of men just joined the Army as raw recruits. So they don't like it too much either. They're not sleeping at home. They don't have good food. They're out in weather like this without a tent and fans. And they're fighting an enemy and seeing people killed. That volunteer soldier in 1862 is not the veteran, hardened, experienced veteran of 1864. So in 62, McClellan could have carried their vote to get this thing over with. In 64, only Abraham Lincoln would have gotten their vote to finish it. We're going to finish this business. It became very personal by 1864. Lincoln won that vote fair and square. McClellan wouldn't have gotten it. Well, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you all very much. I'll be inside. Thank you.